right, thank you all for joining us for the op-ed bootcamp, where we'll talk about what you need to know to publish an op-ed that advocates for press freedom in your state or community. I have just a couple of items to get through as we give folks a few more moments to join, and then we'll get to the presentation. My name is Josh Moore. I'm the Assistant Director of the Student Press Law Center. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Student Press Law Center is the nation's only nonprofit organization devoted to providing legal support and training to student journalists and to advocating for their First Amendment and free press rights. Each year, we organize Student Press Freedom Day as an opportunity to celebrate the important role student journalists play in their communities, as well as to highlight the challenges they face from censorship or otherwise, and to take actions to address those challenges and advance student press freedom. And we're excited that this event is one of those Student Press Freedom Day activities to teach us all how to write op-eds and to advocate for student press freedom. We have several other events coming up this week that we hope you'll check out as well. You can learn about those at studentpressfreedom.org/events. If you have questions throughout Steve's presentation, please feel free to use Zoom's Q&A feature, and we'll have time at the end to try to get to some of those. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker for tonight. Steve Holmes is a veteran journalist with more than 40 years in the business, including at CNN, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, where he was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize. And we're also lucky enough to have him on the board of the Student Press Law Center. Steve?
Thanks, Josh. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me for the session of Op-Ed Bootcamp. Before I begin, let me just state one thing fairly forcefully with regard to what I have to say tonight on writing an op-ed. Writing op-ed is more an art than a science. There are very few hard and rigid rules that you must follow in order to write an effective op-ed and get it placed. Basically, what I'm going to give you tonight are suggestions and guidelines. They're my suggestions and my guidelines. Other people will have different ones, but I think, and I've thought about these for quite some time, that they will be very helpful in allowing you to write really good opinion pieces and getting them placed in newspapers or other news sites. So with that, let's begin. So E. Mateo Diaz is angry. In fact, she's really, really pissed. You can tell from the third paragraph of her op-ed. Let me read it to you. As a transgender person, it has been exhausting to watch my community's basic rights put into jeopardy and framed as subjects for debate. Should trans people be allowed in public bathrooms? Should we be allowed to play sports? Should we be included in school curricula? Should we have access to health care? We are treated like a question to be answered, a problem to be solved. That's pretty strong stuff. Now, you may or may not agree with Diaz's opinion, but her op-ed has something that I believe is an essential ingredient for an effective op-ed. It's infused with passion. Diaz's op-ed doesn't just make you think. It makes you feel. Getting people to feel what you're saying is probably one of the most important qualities for an effective op-ed. What you want to do is have people react to what you're writing, not just think about it. The reaction can be positive and it can be negative, but most of all, you want to get them to react. In fact, you'd rather have somebody react this way to your op-ed than react like this. One very, very important reason you want to get people's juices flowing, you want to get people to react, is that a good op-ed doesn't just express an opinion. A good op-ed is a call to action. A good op-ed, in an op-ed, in your opinion pieces, you want people to get up off their butts and do something. You want them to vote. to petition their elected representatives, to march, to stop marching, to think differently. An effective op-ed inspires people to take action. Here's an example. This is an op-ed that appeared in the Michigan Daily. It was written by a person by the name of Mika Rector Brooks, and it's on gun violence. In it, she notes that opinion writers at a bunch of different college newspapers are banding together to lobby politicians for stricter gun laws. Towards the end, she writes this: "We invite you to join this generation of community organizers, all of us united in demanding a future free of gun violence. We understand the gravity of this commitment because it's not simply our lives we protect with prose and protest, it's our way of life itself." That's pretty good. I mean, what's really good about it is it's definitely a call to action. She's asking people to join her in lobbying and petitioning and lobbying lawmakers for more stricter gun laws. Now, I praise this op-ed, but I have a quibble with it. It could be written more forcefully. If you're going to make your op-eds a call to action, your language should be action oriented. Your scenes that you paint should be very vivid. You should use very strong adjectives. And the most important is that is the use of really strong verbs. Verbs are the superstars of op-ed writing. If you're going to call people to action, you want to use really strong, really active verbs. You want to use verbs like demand or implore or urge or beseech. You want to make sure, again, if you want to call people to action, you have to use action language. I mean, think about the portion of the op-ed I just read, and think of the difference if they had gone one way or the other. In it, they say, she says, "We invite you to join this generation of community organizers." Not bad. But think about it if she had said, "We urge you to join this generation's community of organizers." So I'm saying again, if you want your op-eds to be calls to action, make sure your prose is action oriented. Now, another important aspect of a really good opinion piece is timeliness. Nobody wants to read an opinion piece on an event that happened 2 months ago or 2 years ago. Your op-eds have to be on the news. It may seem very simple, but it's really true that it's got to be something that has just happened. So if you're writing an op-ed on an event, you've got to be Johnny on the spot right after the event has occurred. Make sure that you get it into wherever you're trying to get it published. Or if you can get it in even before the event. If you can write an op-ed in anticipation of something happens, that's all the better. Now, you could ask yourself, well, I'm not clairvoyant. How do I know that something is going to happen? Well, there's a lot of events that you do know that are going to happen. Holidays, elections, speeches, lots of things, sporting events, lots of things will occur that are on the calendar. What's something that's coming up that you can write an op-ed for in anticipation is Student Press Freedom Day. So timeliness is really important. Another thing that's really important is a provocative lead. Now, leads are important in journalism for any kind of story. It could be a news story, a sports story, a movie review, a theater review, a recipe. It doesn't make any difference. Provocative leads are always very good. They're really super important for opinion pieces because you're not talking about an event that people are coming to your story to find out what happened. You're talking about an opinion. And as I'll say later, lots of people will have opinions. You want to make sure that people read yours. And so you need to make sure that you're starting off with something that will grab people's attention right away. Now, luckily, um, un unlike a news story, you don't have to be hemmed in by the who, what, where, when, and why of normal news story leads. You can be a lot more creative and a lot more a lot more provocative. Let me give you an example. This is a op-ed that was submitted to us last year uh, by a woman from University of Indiana. Now check out the lead. It says Indiana University's official motto is Lux e Veritas. In English, that means light and truth. But you wouldn't know it by the way it censors student journalists, skates transparency, and obstructs the truth. Now that's a really good lead. That's you read that and you say, wow, what is she talking about? What did the university do to have her write such a damning lead? So it's kind of lead that will bring you into the story. Now, one of the things that's really important if you're going to have a provocative lead is that you got to make sure you back it up. She has to make sure that the example she sets, she puts forward, back up the assertion that the university is censoring journalists, gating transparency, and obstructing the truth. But it's a really, really good lead. So let me pause here for a quick second, because I think some of you may have a question. And in fact, if you're a really good journalist, you should have two questions. First one, who is this guy? Right? And why should I listen to him? Well, those are questions that should be in your mind, and they're good ones. So let me give you the answer. As Josh mentioned, I'm a former journalist. He mentioned 40 years of experience. It's coming up on 50 actually at at some of the top news organizations in the country. And New York Times, United Press International, Time Magazine. I've worked at all of them. And as he mentioned, while I was at the Times, I worked on a team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001. Now, you should say, well, why am I telling you this? Am I just telling you this to brag on myself? Maybe a little bit. But there's also a reason. Because when you submit your op-ed or your pitch letter for the op-ed, the editors will be asking the same question. Who are you? It's really important. That's one of the first things they know. Right, Judy?
Yes, Steve, that's true. Listen, when I open up a pitch as an opinion editor, I need to know pretty quickly why I should care about what you have to say. Just because you have an opinion on something doesn't mean that you need to be writing an op-ed about that particular topic. And so before you even spend time, all that precious time of yours sitting down to write a piece, you need to think about two main things. Number one, do you have some sort of authority to speak about this particular topic? Are you an expert in this space that you want to talk about? Or do you have some sort of really strong personal connection to the story that you want to weigh in on? Those are usually the two main categories when it comes to having the authority to write a piece. The second thing that you want to think about is your general audience, right? What you have to say, would a general audience really find it interesting? Okay. And is it something new that they haven't heard of before? These are the sort of questions as an editor that I think about when I open up a pitch. And so as a writer, these are the sort of things that you need to be thinking through as well before you write and before you pitch a piece.
So that was Jody Williams, who I used to work with at CNN. She was an opinion writer, an opinion editor at CNN.com. And she used to get pitches from all over the world and op-ed submissions from all over the world and had to decide whether or not she would run them. Now, I can hear what some of you are saying right now. In fact, I can really hear it. Wait a second.
Yes, Steve, that's true.
I'm not an expert, right? That's okay. You're not an expert. You're just a college sophomore, or high school junior. You're not an expert on, you're not an expert historian or political scientist or economist um, or any of these things. Why should anybody listen to you? You're not an expert. Well, that's okay. Because the other thing that Jody said, which is really important, is that do you have any personal experiences with your subject that will allow you to speak with authority? You have to remember that sometimes experience equals expertise. Let me give you an example. This was a piece that was run in the Washington Post by Marcus Pennell, who was a high school student at Northwest High School in Grand Island, Nebraska. Let me read the part of it. The trouble started when I changed 5 letters in my first name. My birth certificate reads Megan, but my peers at Northwest High School in Nebraska knew me as Marcus. Changing my name wasn't supposed to be a political statement, but our local school board turned it into one. Now, essentially, this op-ed has to do with a trans kid who wanted his byline to reflect the gender that he had selected for himself, and that was against school policy. And as a result, and they told him to change the byline. The school refused, and as a result, the local school board basically shut the newspaper down. Now, Marcus isn't an expert on gender issues, but his experience and the experience of his friends and classmates and other people on the newspaper qualified him to render an opinion on this particular subject. By the way, the Student Press Law Center intervened on Marcus's behalf, and some months after the initial decision, the local school board reinstated the newspaper in a digital format. Before I go on, let me make 2 important points. You probably noticed that 2 of the examples I've used in this lecture involve trans students. That's because both of them were effectively written. It's not because I want to give the impression that just trans people have something to say. In fact, I believe that if you're anti-trans, your opinion is something that ought to be shared as well. The point is that you can, no matter what your experiences are, if they can relate to a larger issue, that's your expertise. The second point I want to emphasize in this is a word of caution. Just because you're Black or white or a woman or a man or gay or straight or Christian or Jewish or Muslim or atheist doesn't automatically qualify to speak on a given subject. Editors will only be interested if your experience has some kind of direct bearing on a given issue. So let's take a look at what's next. You've gotten people riled up through forceful writing. You've issued a call to action. You've written a provocative lead. You've demonstrated your expertise or your direct experience with your subject. Now comes the hardest part, the most important part. What you have to realize, and I've hinted at this earlier, everybody out there has opinions. I've got opinions. Your teachers have opinions. Your friends have opinions. Your crazy uncle Charlie has opinions. Everybody's got opinions. Why in the world, full of opinion makers, why should anybody care about yours? Well, in my view, you have to approach this dilemma thinking about one really painful but critical truth. Nobody cares about your opinion. Okay, let me repeat that. Nobody cares about your opinion. You may be the class Victorian, you may be the captain of the football team, you may be on the debating society, you may write really wonderful prose or great poetry. It doesn't make any difference. Nobody cares about your opinion. Oops. Until you make them. That's your job. In fact, it's job number one, to make sure that what you're opining on is important, not necessarily just to you, but to the people that you want to read. That's your goal, to make them care about your opinion. If you don't do that, you might as well have not even written anything at all. So, how do you do that? The first thing, there are a couple of suggestions I'll put forward. First thing is, you got to realize it's not about you. It's about them, the readers, your target audience. Of course, you have to figure out who your target audience is. But once you do that, you need to figure out arguments that will resonate with them, not arguments that make you feel comfortable, but arguments that will resonate with them. Here's a good example. This is an op-ed, again, that was submitted to us last year by William Tom, right? And about school censorship. And let me read the point he makes. While administrative censorship can stop news from surfacing in the short term, it cannot contain information forever. With the added consequence of deepening student administration distrust, censorship is a lose-lose strategy. Now, what I liked about this is that he's not telling you that censoring student journalists is bad for the student journalists. He's saying that the censoring student journalists is bad for the school administration, because word is going to get out, rumors are going to get out. And if people think that news is being censored, then they'll distrust the administrators. So it's not aimed at the students. It's aimed at the people who could potentially censor the students. Here's a related point about making sure that it's not about you. It's about your audience. Try to avoid preaching to the choir. Make your op-ed, you can make your op-ed strong if you just don't aim your arguments at people who already agree with you. Aim at people who you think would disagree with you or might be sitting on the fence. Doing this has the added benefit of forcing you to think more deeply of what you're about to say. Another suggestion: be prescriptive. One of the things, there are a few things that editors of opinion pieces, and I suspect readers of them as well, dislike more than op-eds that implore the powers that be to, quote unquote, do something. Well, the question I always have is, do what? If you're just saying that you want the powers that be to do something and just leave it at that, anybody can say that. Come up with ideas of what should be done. That can get people's attention, and certainly will get the attention of editors that you're trying to convince to run your op-eds. You know, effective op-eds put forward ideas for solving problems. It could be radical ideas. It could be moderate ideas. But they illustrate, by putting forward ideas, what you do is you show that you're different. It's the difference between thinking deeply about an issue and just whining. So again, be prescriptive. And when you're prescriptive, one good way to do that is what I call redemption stories. what is always good is to look at a situation that's not working, that's failing, and that the ideas that you're putting forward in your op-ed have been tried and they've worked. They've improved the situation. It indicates that you've done research and that you've looked around and seen things how things could be made better. And I just think that that tends to really catch the eye, again, of editors and also of readers. One other thing, original thinking. Jody mentioned this. If you put forward something, an idea that somebody hasn't thought about before, suddenly you're going to get editors to think, wow, that's kind of interesting. Let me think about running this particular op-ed. Let me give you an example. Oops, hold on. Hello. This was a op-ed that was actually written by me several years ago. At the time, some of you may remember this, there was a great debate that's still going on about tearing down monuments and statues to Confederate soldiers and Confederate leaders. And the arguments that are being put forward by either side were kind of well worn. You'd heard them. One said that these statues need to be torn down because they're celebrating people who fought to enslave Black people and rebelled against the country. On the other side, people said, well, no, we're just trying to preserve history. So I took the idea, or took the tack, that, by the way, they're saying that they ought to be removed, but I did so by not looking at the monuments that were up there, but looking at a monument to a particular general, James Longstreet, that wasn't. Now, I'll give you a really quick history lesson. I'll try not to bore you with it. James Longstreet was a very able Confederate general who was one time considered Robert E. Lee's right-hand man. But after the war, but you don't see any monuments to Longstreet, or very, very few monuments to Longstreet throughout the South. Now, why is that? Because after the war, he accepted Reconstruction. He worked to get more equality for the freed slaves. And in fact, he led Black militias in pitched street battles against white supremacists in New Orleans. For all that, in many parts of the South, he was considered a traitor. So the idea that Confederate generals should be, that's all about history, well, then it's like, whose history? Is it just the history of people like Confederate General William Bradford Forrest, who after the war started the Ku Klux Klan, who wanted to suppress Black people, or about James Longstreet, who wanted to elevate Black people? So the point is, I'm trying to make here, again, with my history lesson, is that this was an original concept, original thinking that took the debate about statues in a different direction. So one of the things you might be wondering as you think about writing an op-ed is this going to make a difference? Well, let me give you an example of somebody and let him tell you.
Hey everyone, I'm Seth Stern, the Advocacy Director at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I wanted to talk about our op-ed writing campaign in support of the Press Act, the federal shield bill pending in Congress to stop the government from forcing journalists to burn sources. In the last Congress, the bill passed the House without objection, but in the Senate, it only had one Democratic sponsor, Ron Wyden. And it needed two things to have a chance in the Senate: a Republican to co-sponsor it, and Dick Durbin, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to fast-track it for a year-end legislative package. The first thing we did was identify Mike Lee of Utah as a potential Republican sponsor. We thought a bill that would protect journalist sources could appeal to his anti-surveillance leanings. So we placed an op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune, and days later, we learned he was co-sponsoring the bill. We don't know if our op-ed had anything to do with it, but we also placed two op-eds, one for myself and one from our board member, in the Chicago Sun-Times, appealing to Dick Durbin to fast-track the bill. And this time we know it worked because Durbin wrote a letter to the editor of the Sun-Times saying he'd read the op-eds, he agreed with them, he'd fast-track the bill. Ultimately, the bill didn't pass in the last Congress. It was late in the year, and with the year-end legislative rush, one Senator, Tom Cotton, was able to derail the bill. But it's back in this Congress, and now we've got Durbin sponsoring it along with Wyden and Lee, and we've also got Lindsey Graham co-sponsoring it. And that might have had something to do with another op-ed we placed in the Post and Courier in his home state of South Carolina. So if you're ever questioning whether op-eds make a difference, that's some proof that they do. 3 senators signed up to co-sponsor what, in our view, is the most important press freedom legislation in modern history after op-eds appealing to them to do so. And one of them expressly confirmed that the op-eds are what led him to get on board. And I should note that none of these op-ed placements came from personal connections. They came from cold emails pitching opinion page editors. So even if you don't know anyone at a paper, don't let that stop you from trying. Thanks everyone for listening, and good luck with your op-ed writing.
So that was Seth Stern, Director of Advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. His organization puts out their own tips on writing effective op-eds. The URL down at the bottom of the screen is basically sends you to a guide on their suggestions for effective op-eds. When you go back and take a look at this, make sure you get down the URL, click on it, and see some of their ideas and their suggestions. Some of them, I've looked at them, are kind of along the same lines of what I have said. Some of them are quite different. Doesn't make any difference. It's just another way to another set of suggestions. So I've given you a bunch of sort of broad concepts. Let's talk about a couple of very specific things about what you should do in writing your opinion pieces.
Hey everyone,
First, a couple of important tips. Be concise. Don't write any more than 800 to 900 words is optimal. You might think that your prose is really wonderful and that you can go on longer than that. Nothing will anger an editor more than something you've been told to write a certain length and you write more than that. Sometimes they want less, 500 words. Give them what they want in terms of length. Make sure your writing is clear. I always suggest to anybody who's whatever they're writing, whether it's an op-ed, a news story, a term paper, whatever, before you turn it in, read your piece aloud. Your ears are wonderful editors. If you read your pieces aloud, you'll pick up typos, you'll find dropped words, you'll find run-on sentences. Reading your pieces aloud is always a very, very effective editing. One other thing, make sure all your facts are correct. No, any editor will get really angry if you turn in an op-ed and you tell them that, as Seth mentioned, that Lindsey Graham is Democrat from South Carolina. Lindsey Graham's a Republican. You give them an op-ed with incorrect facts, it will automatically go in the trash. So make sure you do your research and that all your facts are correct. I'll give you a word about pitching. It's really important that you not think about writing your op-ed and pitching your op-ed as two separate activities. They go hand in hand. In fact, what's really a good idea is that you when you're writing your pitch letter, you write it as if it was a summary of your op-ed with a really good lead, really good examples, really good nut grab, and also the reason why you're the perfect person to write this piece. Which brings up another point. Know your site. Know it is the news organization that you're pitching. You should take some time before you pitch them and to familiarize yourself with the kind of op-eds they write and their general sort of editorial ideology, for example. For example, the Wall Street Journal, their opinion page and a lot of their op-eds tend to be very critical of college administrators, right? They tend to think that college administrators are complete idiots. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but if you have an example of your college administration doing something that you think is particularly stupid, think about it. Who might want to read about that and might want to run it? Wall Street Journal. One other thing, be nimble. What do I mean by that? You may have an idea or a particular approach in your opinion piece, and you pitch it to the editor, and he or she looks at it and says, that's not bad, but let's emphasize this portion of your thought process as opposed to what you particularly want to emphasize. If you're comfortable with it, be nimble enough to possibly switch your emphasis or switch your approach around. Now, I stress, if you're comfortable with it, you don't want to write something you don't believe. Anybody will see through that in a minute. But if there's some ways to change it that an editor would like, be open to that. Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to write a piece on an upcoming speech by a particular politician. And the editor says, well, we've got a lot of pieces on that already. Well, and say, well, how about if I write a piece rather than before his speech? How about I write a piece after his speech, analyzing and opining on what he had to say? Nothing wrong with that. Be nimble. Now, where do I place it? Where do I pitch it to? I always say, start with your local newspaper. I know all of us want to get op-eds in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. Fine. That's a wonderful goal. But start local. Not only your local newspaper, but your college newspaper. It does a couple of things. It's easier to place it there than it would be to place it in the Washington Post. But as you get pieces published in your local newspaper or your college newspaper, you build up a track record. And so when you do try to pitch something to a major news organization, and you can mention in your pitch letter and give them examples of op-eds that you've already written that have been published. Now, I mentioned your college newspaper. Think about also the possibility of not just your college newspaper, but another college newspaper. Think of a situation, if you run across a situation, let's say you're attending Purdue University, right? And Purdue University, and you notice that the University of that Indiana University has an issue going on its campus that Purdue has already dealt with. Well, go to Indiana and say, hey, look, you're dealing with this particular issue. I'm a student at Purdue. We've already dealt with this. Let me write an opinion piece on how we dealt with it and what the impact has been. A lot of people would say, that's not a bad idea. Let's do that. Oops. So anyhow, last point to make, and that is your pitch letter. I kind of mentioned this before. Your pitch letter should be basically a summary of what you're going to write. Put a lot of time into your pitch letter. Make sure that your tone is respectful, but authoritative enough. Make sure that it flows smoothly, that you illuminate all the points that you want to make. And again, as I've mentioned before, make sure that you tell them why it is that you're the perfect person to write this op-ed. Anyhow, I hope I've given you some suggestions on what you should do, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, if folks have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A feature. in Zoom, and we do have a little bit of time to address some of those, but we don't have any so far.
Well, don't be shy. While we're waiting, Josh, maybe perhaps you can mention some of the upcoming events.
Yeah, of course. That's a great idea. If you don't mind advancing to the next slide, that I believe it should have a list of our upcoming events for folks for Student Press Freedom Day. We do have a lot of activities happening this week, both skills building workshops like this, but also some timely discussions of important topics. So you can find those at studentpressfreedom.org/events. And we do have a question. So how do you prevent your opinion article from sounding too newsy? In other words, how to balance facts and opinion?
That's a really good question. Especially, and it's particularly difficult for people who are reporters who are used to just dealing with facts and trying very hard not to express an opinion. I would suggest that the main thing you do is, as you're putting forward particular facts, if you're telling a story, telling a narrative, and you're putting forward these facts, think to yourself, does that fact make sense? Or what does that fact mean? And form an opinion about it, and then express that opinion. So any opinion that you're going to render has to start with facts anyway. So don't be afraid that your opinion piece sounds too much like a news story. I would, if you're going to air more on the side of your opinion pieces sounding very newsy, as opposed to your opinion pieces sounding way just too opinionated. In other words, putting out opinions with no facts behind it. So I wouldn't worry too much about it sounding too much like a news story. Just as I said, mention the facts and then have an opinion about the fact that you just mentioned.
Great. Any last questions that anyone would like to ask? Feel free to put those in the Q&A feature. And then while we're taking just a moment, I'll drop the link in the chat to the list of events that I was just mentioning. So tomorrow we have a conversation on the state of college press freedom, and then also a conversation with a couple of CNN reporters who will be sharing their advice for student journalists, as well as some stories from their time covering some of the most important stories happening in our country right now. So those are two events happening tomorrow. Then there'll be several other events happening the rest of the week. So be sure to check those out at studentpressfreedom.org/events. And it looks like we don't have any other questions. So Steve,
If I could, Josh, something that I'm often asked, I'm surprised I wasn't asked this time. People often ask me, once I pitch an opinion piece, how long should I wait if I haven't heard back from them? My answer is a week, 10 days, no more than 2 weeks. All right. And if you haven't heard back, you probably would assume that they don't want it. But don't accept this rejection meekly. And even if you have heard back and they said, oh, we're not interested, don't accept it meekly. Get back in touch with the editor. Be polite. Don't be belligerent. And ask some questions about what was it about the piece that I submitted that was not up to the standards or up to par for what you normally would run. In other words, politely and pointedly, but not belligerently, ask, why was I rejected? And ask them if they could give you suggestions as to ways that perhaps the next time you pitch an opinion piece, that it might be accepted. Some editors would really appreciate this. Some editors don't want to give you the time of day. I mean, it's a crapshoot. You just have to take your chances. But an editor that wants to be somewhat of a teacher will really appreciate someone who wants to be somewhat of a student. And one of the things that you would say to them is, I'm interested in your feedback so that the next time I pitch an opinion piece or write an opinion piece, it will be accepted. That has the benefit of not only telling them that you're open to suggestions, but telling them you'll be back.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. And thank you all again for joining us for this event for Student Press Freedom Day. We hope to see you around at other Student Press Freedom Day events. And we hope that you'll use these skills to write about student press freedom and events happening in your community. And if so, please reach out, share this with us. We'd love to see them. Make sure to send them our way either by tagging us on social media at the Student Press Law Center, or you can send an email to me directly. I'll put my email in the chat. You should also hopefully get it through the Zoom confirmation, but I just dropped that link in the chat. We hope to see you around, and thanks again.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.